Hi, and welcome to the Vocal Fries Podcast, the podcast about linguistic discrimination.
I'm Megan Figueroa.
And I'm Carrie Gillen. And today we have a very exciting guest, Dr. Bob Kennedy, who is yet another Canadian linguist, which we forgot to mention in the actual main part of the episode, but...
Do y'all have like a Google Doc where you just like all chat with each other or something? Like, shared.
No, but Canadians do all know other Canadians because...
No, I know. Remember when I was just a wee girl in one of your classes, like the first class I took with you, I went up to you after class and asked you if you knew so and so, and then I got really embarrassed and I was like, I'm sorry, I don't think all Canadians know each other.
Who did you ask me about? I do not remember this conversation.
Andrew Carney.
Oh. Yeah, and I didn't know him yet.
Yeah, but you've heard of him.
Of course.
Yeah,
of course.
But I think once it came out of my mouth, I was like, I really do think all Canadian linguists know each other.
A great percentage of Canadian linguists do know each other. Yes. Or at least we know of each other.
Yeah. No, it's an exciting episode because it's kind of different.
There's so many music clips in it. It's so fun.
Yeah, it's a fun episode. So happy summer, bitches.
I love it.
So I was like, was I on Twitter? Yeah, I was on Twitter and I saw that there's this new podcast. And I'm not like saying listen to it, but this is why it caught my attention. It's from Cricket Media and it's called Hysteria.
Oh, yeah.
Exclamation point.
Yeah.
And when I went to it on the iTunes preview, it describes it as this. Political commentator and comedy writer Aaron Ryan is joined by a bicoastal squad of opinionated, mouthy women to discuss blah, 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 blah. So I love it. They're like totally, I guess like we call it like reclaiming the word hysteria and mouthy and opinionated.
Yes.
So it's great. I thought that was a fun thing to see today. Those are all things that are associated with women negatively, of course. So yeah. Yeah,
and she's really great whenever she's a guest on Pod Save America. So
her Twitter's great. I mean,
yes, I've been following it for a while now. Yeah. It should be good.
Yeah.
Speaking of podcasts, I was just listening to Atlanta Monster. And the newest episode's a live episode, but Maurice, the private investigator from Up and Vanished, he was talking about how he was worried that his accent would actually damage the Up and Vanished podcast.
Aww.
And my heart broke. And then he said, but then it turned out it actually helped it. And my heart soared.
Oh, what an emotional roller coaster.
But I was just like, exactly. It's so problematic. And I didn't know this until today. He has a PhD. A man with a PhD was insecure about his accent because it's Southern. Oh. So anyway.
Yeah. There was like a New York Times opinion piece written by a woman who was saying that she was afraid for her young son who has a Southern drawl, she says, if he'll be discriminated against. It's real.
It's real.
Yeah.
And it might be worse for men because, men are just going to be interpreted as being racist and sexist, I think, with that accent, as we talked about before.
Yeah. Although, I don't know if anyone's already listened to the latest My Favorite Murder, if they're fans, but Karen talks about an Appalachian Trail murder, and she talks so positively about like
That's true.
Yeah, so you also get the good old boy kind of thing.
Although good old boy has a very specific meaning, and she meant it in a different way than I think it means now.
Oh, okay.
Like when I think of a good old boy, like she actually sort of had to like say it, like, but in a good way, because good old boy kind of has this like, you're gonna protect your other fellow, like it's like an old boys club kind of a thing.
Oh, I don't have that.
No,
but
okay.
I can see it.
Yeah, I have a slightly negative. Well, actually, very negative interpretation for good old boy.
Well, she totally didn't mean negative.
Yeah, no, she didn't. But she did correct herself, as she said, but in a good way, because she knew that this negative connotation existed.
Okay, maybe a generational thing.
Maybe.
But also, just a plug for our own podcast, you should listen to, if you enjoyed hearing about the Appalachian Trail, listen to our episode with Dr. Paul Reed, because he is a delight.
Yes, he is.
It's not because of his accent, but his accent's fantastic, because everyone's accent's fantastic. But yeah.
And also, he taught us how to say Appalachian correctly, which Karen didn't.
I know, because Appalachian is the way he described people that would come in, right? Like the
carpetbagger kind of thing.
Yeah.
And I didn't know before that because...
No. I mean, how would we?
I mean, yeah, as a Canadian, how would I know?
And as an American, how would I care about anyone but myself?
Oh, that makes me cry. Okay. I wanted to talk about this Rachel Bloom, Neil Patrick Harris kerfuffle, as Slate put it. And I didn't know because I don't know. It just didn't come into my Twitter feed, or I wasn't on Twitter. I'm not sure. But apparently Neil Patrick Harris posted, "Who is the woman in the top hat backstage at the Tony Awards?" Gideon remarked that she says "like" and "oh my god" a lot. I'm confused. So let's start with the linguistic stuff.
Yeah.
How dare a woman say "like" or "oh my god"?
Right.
How dare we?
Yeah.
I just was like, it was so upsetting that he did this.
I know. I mean, are you a fan?
I like him.
I mean, you expect more from him almost.
Yeah, he seemed like a on the scale of things, a pretty decent guy. But, and I, in the grand scheme of things, this is obviously not that big of a deal, but it's one of those little drips about, of all the sexism that we have to deal with. It's just one of the many drips. And so it was just really upsetting that he thought that this was an acceptable thing to complain about.
I know. And I was thinking, the "oh my god" thing, I guess it goes back to like a stereotypical view of Valley Girl?
Yeah.
I don't know, like what's so upsetting about that? I mean, I guess I know Catholics don't love it. I mean,
well,
there are some very religious people that don't love, I don't know, is that taking the Lord's name in vain?
Yes, of course it is. Even I know that. Yeah, I mean, yeah, so if you're a really pretty strong Christian of any faith, any variety of it, yeah, you probably shouldn't be saying it. But I don't think that's what he's talking about.
Yeah, but that's not what no, it's not at all what he's talking
about. No, for him, it's just more of a silly, girly thing, I think.
Yeah. And then the "like," we've talked about it.
Yes, we've already talked about "like."
People don't want women to say "like."
Yes. Even though it's totally fine and men do it too, and so stop. Stop it.
Yeah. Yeah, we love "like." We've already said it.
And then on top of that, it turns out he knows her.
I know.
I guess he didn't recognize her? Because I don't think he's that mean that he would have shaded her like that. You know what I mean? Like...
Yeah. No, I don't think he recognized her, and...
Yeah.
They've met a lot.
Yeah, at least a few times, and...
Yeah.
Anyway.
But yeah, it doesn't feel great.
No.
When you know you've met someone multiple times.
Yeah, and like, I know that he's a lot more famous than she is, but still, it was icky.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Housekeeping.
Yeah, a couple pieces of housekeeping. So a reminder that we're going to be at the Putter and Love Convention in New Orleans, August 10th to 12th, and we hope that at least some of you can make it.
Yeah.
I'm looking forward to being in New Orleans again.
Yeah, or have a drink with us or something. Maybe we can have a little meetup if there are people.
And I definitely recommend not having the purple drink.
Yeah.
dangerous drink. But yeah, if you're around if you're gonna go, let us know. And yeah, we'd love to get some beignets or get a drink.
Oh, yeah.
Something.
Yeah.
And then the second piece of housekeeping is we had 2 new patrons last month that we want to thank. Helen Nolan, and someone who wishes to remain anonymous. And the only reason why I'm bringing that up is because I want people to know that if they want to remain anonymous, they don't want to be thanked on our podcast, absolutely just let us know, and we will respect your wishes. So thank you, anonymous person.
Yes, thank you.
And I think that's it. So I hope you enjoy this musical episode.
Yay!
It was super fun.
Yeah, I know.
Okay, Okay, so today we have Dr. Bob Kennedy from the University of California, Santa Barbara with us to talk about music, linguistics and music, which we've never touched on before, so I'm pretty excited about that. So he's a lecturer at Santa Barbara, and he's also been on Jeopardy!
Oh, what?
You didn't know that? No! I thought I told you!
I don't go around telling everybody, but I did put it on the back of the textbook that I wrote as part of the author bio.
As you should.
Yeah. I mean, I was interviewed for NPR's All Things Considered once, and I put that on like my bios everywhere, so I totally get that. I feel like it's going to be on my gravestone. But yeah, So we had Alex Darcy, who was an answer or a question on Jeopardy, and now we have
she's part of the question.
Part of the question, and now we have a contestant. It's very exciting.
Maybe one day you can get a producer or even a host to talk on your show.
Ooh, that would be exciting. Hey, Jeopardy, if you want to get on the show, let us know.
Yeah.
So you're a linguist.
Yes.
As most of our guests are. But you call yourself a hobbyist as a musician. So what does that mean?
I have been playing music since I was a teenager. I went through that stage in adolescence where I discovered that there was more than what was played on the radio, I guess you could say. And so, that's the age where people start to identify with a particular genre of music that they really enjoy. I guess at the time I wanted to learn to play some of the songs as well. So I didn't have music training, but I taught myself a lot about stuff having to do with musical composition and instrumentation and stuff. And I don't think I ever got to be a very good musician, but I tried to keep track of a lot of, I guess, information and details about a lot of different genres. And I went through probably a couple different phases of musical fandom, I guess, over the course of the following decades and so forth. And I guess I've always found myself paying attention to details in song, the way that a linguist would pay attention to details just in any sort of performed or naturally occurring speech of any other type. So because of that, I feel like I've kind of accumulated a fair amount of knowledge about just a wide variety of different styles of music, even though I don't like all varieties of music. I definitely have tastes, but when I talk about it from this point of view, I intend to be basically objective and descriptive about it at the same time. Since we're talking about music and people often have very strong opinions just about quality of music and their taste in genres and so forth, it's a risky territory to get into because you always have the chance that a listener or a group of listeners will respond in a way that they suggest something like, well, I can't believe you didn't mention so-and-so, or I can't believe you did mention so-and-so. And so I don't mean to either unfairly include or exclude any particular artist in whatever it is that we talk about today. And I wouldn't say that we should only talk about people who are really commercially widely known, or the opposite. I mean, both kind of branches of musical fame, I think, are worth looking into in a lot of detail. But anyway, as a hobbyist, I guess, to go back to your original question, it's just I've paid a lot of attention to a lot of different things along the way. And so we could talk about modern pop music, we could talk about classic rock, we can talk about R&B, we can talk about American music, British music. We could acknowledge the fact that there's that unfortunate binarity of American versus British music, when in the English-speaking world there's a bunch of other nations with their own, entire cultures of performers and so forth. So all of that to pay attention to, I guess, is stuff that we can turn to. But hobbyist is something that I would have to call myself because I never got formal training in it in the way that I did for linguistics.
Right.
I was going to ask when you started to couple the linguist with the hobbyist.
I think it was relatively later. I do remember, probably two different phases. One of them early on, when I was a young adult, I used to try to compose and record music, and it wasn't that great, and I don't have the recordings to share with you, so I'll spare you.
Darn it.
I'll see if I can dig them up. But yes. I remember, no, I don't actually have recordings of the vocal stuff. But I remember at the time when I was trying to see if I could sing over music that I had composed, thinking about whether I should drop my R's or not in song. And it's such a huge relevant variable across so many different genres. So by dropping R's, for some of your audience, they might be familiar exactly what I mean by that. The technical term would be to whether to be rhotic or not, whether to go non-rhotic or employ rhoticity. Either way, it's whether you pronounce the R's at the end of syllables. So do you say heart and start, or do you say hot and stot? And, for all of us, as our non-Northeastern United States American accents or Canadian accents, we're all rhotic. But many people, even though they've got a rhotic accent when they sing, they go non-rhotic, which is kind of a big talking point that we could cover today. I remember at the time kind of thinking, I feel like that's inauthentic, and I don't even know if I had that word in my vocabulary at the time. But it occurred to me that people do this. And so it was at least on my mind. And then later on through my graduate studies, when I started looking more at accent variation and so forth, I kept coming across examples of discussions that people would have about the performativeness of dialect and accent. So I would start to notice a whole lot more about what people would do performatively, whether they were trying to employ something other than their own dialect or accent when they performed. And it's actually, it's something you could talk about with pretty well any artist or any song that you hear. Is that are they using their own voice or not? So the potential data or range of data to look at is the entirety of the song. It is huge.
Yeah.
So we can try to wrestle with the size of the data set here too. But
yeah, even if you're only talking about American and British songs,
yeah,
which is a tiny part of what's going on in the entire world, but even with just that, it's huge.
Yes, definitely. Even just if you stick within the United States.
Yes.
Which is probably a reasonable starting point, but talking about just what happens amongst American performers, I think, is really central to the entire discussion. But then the British angle as a way of people from another nation adopting and performing what it's essentially a set of American genres, I think, informs the discussion about performativeness, definitely.
Yeah, agreed.
So I'd want to talk about both, definitely.
Yes. So let's start with this, as you call it, folk linguistic myth, that accents disappear in song performance. I think that's a really important thing. I think a lot of people believe that. So can you talk about that and explain why that is a myth?
Yeah. So, I mean, do you believe the myth, or do you believe that it is a widely held belief?
Both.
I believe that it's a widely held belief.
Okay.
Until I read this, I thought that accents mostly disappeared. And I'm a linguist.
Yeah, exactly.
I know, but it's a conclusion I think that's a really reasonable thing for someone to jump to given what they hear in song. And if they are aware that someone has a certain way of speaking as in terms of an accent or a dialect, and they know about that when the person is not performing, and then they also hear that person perform, then of course they think, well, the accent's gone. So there must be something about the act of singing itself that takes away the accent. And I don't have the evidence collected in front of me to demonstrate this for you, but I think it would be fairly easy to find like well-publicized or widely published editorial pieces where the writer, who is not a linguist and maybe not even a musician either, basically advances the claim that music does this to people's voices, that it makes them lose their accent and maybe gravitate towards some central, unmarked, unaccented variety, which of course you all know doesn't really exist.
Right.
Or there might be something like there's something about singing that makes people sound American. And that might be something that comes out in the ideologies of British folk linguistics in particular, that music just does that. And so it probably bundles together with a bunch of ideologies that people have about variation in general, that perhaps, maybe they think of American voices as being somehow more primal, and therefore when you're singing, you're more primal, and therefore you sound more American. And it makes no sense to us objectively, right? But it's a just so story that makes for a really nice narrative to explain what people see. And what people see is that often a performer has a different voice when they sing compared to how they actually speak otherwise.
Yeah, so actually, the first time I really thought about this was my dad told me, hey, look, if you hear British singers singing rock music, at least, they put on an American accent. But that's the way he put it. So it wasn't that there was no accent or that song always did this. It was very specific to a genre. So I think that helped me not buy into the myth that way.
Yes. Yeah. And there's some well-documented examples of that, some well-executed research from Peter Trudgill in his textbook on dialect that actually tracks a lot of this quantitatively with basically 1960s era British musicians and trying to measure the extent to which they adopt American structures. And it brings up another question, though, which is, what is it that we're even detecting or measuring when we're trying to make these evaluations? So a layperson audience might hear a singer and think, oh, I see, this person sounds American, or is sounding American, or has lost their accent. But they don't necessarily have the tools or the expertise to point out exactly what it is that the performer is or is not doing. And because of that, they actually can't measure like the accuracy or the authenticity of the performance either. So what Trudgill did was, I think much of that quantitative analysis had to do with whether the British performers would be rhotic in song. The findings were that, at least in some songs by some performers, British performers who were pretty well uniformly non-rhotic in natural speech would project rhoticity as they performed. And that's one fairly strong differentiation between British and American Englishes, with the exception being that there are the rhotic British varieties, and then there's the non-rhotic American varieties. But the conceptualization that British performers have is that to be American, you should sound rhotic, despite the fact that some Americans aren't. And then, I don't know if you tracked this other one, but the other one possible detail that, and I know that there are British singers who do this, is the extent to which they undo this splitting up of the vowel that you hear in words like trap, that they don't have the same vowel in words like bath or pass or glass. And instead, they've got something more like gloss or poth. And it shows up in words like dance as well, which is, a word that's going to show up in song a lot. So in a Southern British variety, it'll show up as dance, whereas in an American variety, it'll show up as dance. And they actually think of this as an American innovation because they think that anything that Americans do is an innovation. But
right.
So Americans do this.
It's so true. We'll take credit for everything.
I know. Yeah, sure. But it's such a frustrating thing to have to deal with, because with this particular variable, just like with rhoticity, these are there in American English because they hadn't happened yet at the kind of earliest phases of English colonization. So it's kind of a last couple centuries London thing that has spread to some of England, but not all of England, to do this. But at any rate, a British singer may or may not choose to adopt that American pattern and make all of their bath and pass and dance vowels the same as their trap vowels or not. And I can't recall whether Trudgill tracked this particular thing, but I think that some of the performers that he would have been talking about in his analysis did this, Americanized their bath vowel in their performance. And so we're talking about performers like Rolling Stones and the Beatles and The Who, in that era of widely known, widely famous British musicians.
People try to put us to down, talking about my generation, just because we get around, talking about my generation, things they do look awful.
Yeah, and thinking of myself as the ignorant bystander, I had no idea the Rolling Stones were British for a very long time.
That, speaks a lot to what it is that Mick Jagger does when he performs. And I think he is a little bit different from the Beatles. Well, of course, he's very different from the Beatles in a lot of different ways. But one of them is the particular choice of performance that he goes for. So in the work of the Beatles, there's variability in what they target from song to song. So some of the songs are much more clearly meant to sound American, and some of them are very much not intended to sound that way. With the singers, whether it's John or Paul, doing this, making use of the things like employing rhoticity or not. But they were going for something, I would probably characterize it as more of a generally unidentifiable American genre, whereas in Mick Jagger's case, I think a lot more of his performance really targets blackness in his voice. I think that really stands apart there. In part because he doesn't use rhoticity in the ways that the Beatles would sometimes use in some of their performances.
And so that, for me, brings up the issue of appropriation.
Yes.
So I guess two questions. How is he targeting blackness, and what does that mean when it comes to appropriation of blackness?
Yeah, it's a multitude of questions that come up out of this, and it's he's actually not the first person I would pick on as an example of appropriation of anything. And it's a very good question to ask. What are the things that people use when they engage in an appropriation of an African American English variety as opposed to other American English varieties? And the features that people draw upon depend a lot on what they're aware of and how well they can do them, and what they think is probably what they believe to be accurate of their targeted variety, kind of irrespective of whether they do it with some amount of accuracy or not. So what I guess you could call authentic African American English performances, whether it's R&B or hip hop, the voices match the target, or the target matches the voice, I guess you could say. So by target, I mean, what is the genre that the performer is trying to impart upon the music, and the voice of the performer is, their dialect or their accent as a background. And in a lot of kinds of genres of music, we can find that the performer is just using their own voice and not performing something other than their own phonological and grammatical system, you could say. So that's generally true of the entire range of R&B, or just about the entire range of hip hop, where the performers are themselves African American and actual speakers of at least one African American variety. At the same time, people who instead perform the variety without being authentic speakers outside of the context of the performance are probably picking up on whatever feature that they think they need to do to perform the variety, in the same way or in a parallel way to what a British singer would do to try to perform a generally American variety. So they might not get all the features, but at the same time, they might do it passively enough that they would trick their audience into thinking, just by the sound of their voice, that they're black, just by the sound of their accent. The question of what it is that they're doing is one thing. The question of how well they can convince their audience is another question. And I think the angle of appropriation in the discussion is yet another one. I would want to say generally this is all appropriation that we're talking about. Anytime any singer is singing in an accent not his or her own, then they're appropriating. But the clearly problematic examples are the ones in which there's a power differential between the background of the performer and the culture of the variety that they are appropriating when they're doing the performance. And if that happens, then that's clearly the more problematic type of appropriation that can happen, especially if it ends up being the case that the people who get the most credit or the most acclaim within the genre are people who are not actual speakers of the variety that, should have been associated with the origins of the genre in the first place.
And so I'm immediately thinking of Justin Timberlake.
Interesting that you'd bring that up. Yes.
Well, I mean, it's actually not interesting if you knew me, because big NSYNC fan when I was about 10, so I'm always thinking of this. But yes, no, if 20 years ago you told me, 10-year-old me, that I'd be talking about Justin Timberlake on a podcast, I wouldn't have known, Podcast didn't exist, so of course this could have never happened. But yeah. So yeah, no, I like anytime Justin Timberlake performs, if I'm like on Twitter, I notice that people are calling him out for this specifically.
Yes. Yeah. And I think it makes sense that people would call him out, because they can detect this degree of linguistic appropriation in his performance.
Right.
And it's, if you did not know who he was, where he was from, or anything else about his background, and you heard him, you might assume, just on the basis of his performance, that he was African American.
Right.
Or you might not. Or you might, if you know enough, then you might hear it and think, okay, here's someone trying to sound that way. It comes across then as a textbook example of appropriation. I think it fits into that category then of the problematic type because of the fact that he has acquired so much fame and acclaim as a performer and as a singer, in part performing in a variety that's not his own.
Right.
Can you give us an example of the features that he's putting on?
Yeah, so the things that he would be doing would be, and we have to come back to this again and again, he goes non-rhotic when he performs. And non-rhoticity is at least a variable feature of many African-American English varieties. Not all of them, and it's not uniformly the case, but of the American varieties that are non-rhotic or can be non-rhotic, African-American English, especially those most or more closely associated with the American South, are non-rhotic. And then in addition to that, I would say some leveling out of diphthongs of the type that you would also hear from Southern Americans. So time instead of time, which could be sort of a song-driven rather than performative feature, but it nevertheless shows up in song like this, and it fits the performative model in this case. Also, I would say some monophthongization. I know that's a technical term, but something like a fairly steady state O vowel, as opposed to more of a contoured O sound that you would probably hear in his own speech in an interview, away from the context of actually performing. And so that's actually, that particular feature is one that helps to separate or differentiate African American Englishes from other varieties of Southern American English.
I did not know that.
Yeah. So those two things I think would do it. Maybe also some, and it's hard to talk about this if we're only really relying on sound in the podcast, but the low vowel space of, on the one hand, words with that a vowel of trap versus the a vowel of lot, and then the other a vowel of thought, which for the three of us is the same as lot. So how that thought vowel is employed differs across the Northeast to the South to the rest of the nation. And if somebody says something like on or off or on or off, those are things that one could employ as part of their performativeness. Also, what somebody does with the a vowel of trap, if they say something more like trap, or if they say the a vowel of stop in something, or of stop or lot, then that is something that really, really subtly could show up in a performance. And it's harder to identify, I think, for everybody, as opposed to something like rhoticity or anything else. But I'm thinking of, what's that? Not the current song, but the song from Trolls.
I don't know.
Can't Stop This Feeling.
All those things I shouldn't do, but you dance, dance, dance. And ain't nobody leaving soon, so keep dancing. I can't stop the feeling. So just dance, dance, dance. So just dance.
Oh, okay, I do know that song.
Every time I hear it, I just focus on the way that he says that word stop.
I can't stop the. I can't stop them. I can't stop.
And it sounds to me like he's really targeting an accent not his own, an African American accent, producing that particular vowel there. So there's a range of different things he's doing. It goes beyond rhoticity, and it certainly goes beyond word choice and anything else like that. Maybe another thing to point out is that I would imagine a lot of people assume that the most obvious markers are saying things like singing instead of singing. So changing that final consonant, which is less of a regional marker than a formality marker, but that might be something people believe to be what is going on, but that's probably one of the least relevant things in that kind of performance.
Yeah, because you hear that also in country music or just informal speech, like you said.
Everywhere.
Yeah, everywhere. Yeah. So I would like to talk about Iggy Azalea, because that's another example of this. And she seems to perform it even more than Justin Timberlake.
Oh, way more. Yeah. I think I don't certainly mean to apologize for Justin Timberlake, but he's somewhere between the two. He's somewhere between Mick Jagger and Iggy Azalea. And I think that in Timberlake's case, I'm coming at this from someone who doesn't feel like the direct effect of the appropriation, but I have got the sense that he doesn't deny the blackness of his attempt of performance. He acknowledges the fact that he leans on this appropriation. He doesn't use that word, but I think he's aware of the source of what he borrows. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And I think in Iggy Azalea's case, it's much, much more unapologetic. And I think that tone deaf would be kind of a euphemism for her own attitude about what she does. And what she does is actually far, far deeper phonologically in terms of her performance. And again, I don't think I'm in a position to evaluate whether she nails it and does it perfectly accurately, but what she employs linguistically in her performance is a much more obvious example of someone who is not black trying to sound black in their performance.
First things first, I'm the realest. Drop this and let the whole world feel it. Let them feel it. And I'm still in the murder business. I can hold you down like I'm giving lessons in physics. Right. You should want a bad bitch like this. Huh? Drop it low and pick it up just like this. Yeah.
And she sort of sounds more specific too. I don't know which variety it is, but I don't know because I'm not an expert in this at all. But she sounds more targeted of a particular variety, whereas Justin Timberlake is more like pan African American English.
I think that's a fair statement. Yeah. I think that she goes for something that's a more urban variety that we more closely associate with what we hear in modern hip hop as opposed to what we hear in modern R&B. And that actually is, I think, a really relevant point that distinguishes the two types, in that what Timberlake does is he's not a hip hop performer, but he's not a rapper. He's a singer, and the genres that he draws upon, both in his training and what he tends to perform, is more R&B in nature. Whereas what people like Iggy Azalea do, and Macklemore, that's another name that we can throw in here at the same time. What performers like that do is they're adopting a genre of hip hop that is closely associated with a particular language variety and using the language variety, I guess, in tandem with the appropriation, just of the musical genre, independently of the linguistic appropriation.
Walk into the club like, what up? I got a big pack. I'm just pumped. I bought some shit from a thrift shop. Ice on the fringe is so damn frosty. The people like, damn, that's a cold ass honky. Rolling in hella deep, headed to the mezzanine.
And I was listening to Macklemore before we made this call just to see what was going on with him, and it's I think really similar to what Iggy Azalea does. Maybe not quite as all in, but he does it a fair amount as well. And I don't mean this as an insult to him, but he's kind of like a modern day Vanilla Ice.
How can you not mean that?
Well, so I mean, clearly he's a better performer and he's a better artist and he's got better production behind him.
That's true.
But the same type of appropriation was there in the work of Vanilla Ice. That here's this person who was clearly of a background that had nothing to do with the modern African American experience, performing an African American genre, a new one, a relatively new one at the time, and adopting an African American voice as he did so.
And I don't know if you have any thoughts on this, but would Eminem be different than Macklemore, because Eminem has this experience growing up around African American English and being in Detroit?
Yeah, I think it's fair to put Eminem in kind of a different group and actually kind of put him in the category of hip hop performers who perform in their own voice. And so it's not as obvious an example of appropriation in his case because he's not really appropriating. It could be mistaken for that if you just look at him. But if you know about his background and everything else like that, then he's not performing something different from what he himself as a speaker brings to the table.
Right.
Y'all act like you never seen a white person before. Jaws all on the floor like Pam, like Tommy just burst in the door and started whooping her ass first than before. They first were divorced, sewing her over furniture. It's the return of the... Oh, wait, no, wait, you're kidding. He didn't just say what I think he did he? And Dr. Dre...
I want to know what you think about what does it count to sound country?
So country music is obviously very culturally closely associated with the South and with Nashville. Many of its kind of founding musicians were Southerners and performed in Southern voices. And so I think that the modern layperson's conception of country music is that the singer should sound Southern when they sing. And it's such a strong association that if you look at the types of dialect maps that people draw in a perceptual dialectology task of the type that Dennis Preston has people do, then sometimes what they will actually do is this is okay. So this is a task where you're just given a map of a place like the United States, and you're to divide it up into regions, and based on how they speak differently, and then you label the regions however you want. So it's not meant to really get information about real varieties. It's meant to get information about attitudes that people have about regional varieties, irrespective of whether their conceptualizations are accurate or not. And a common thing that shows up on these types of maps, that when people mark off the South, which they always do, there's always a Southern section in a map like this, they often label them with terms like country. So there are people out there, a non-trivial number of Americans, who think of a Southern accent as a country accent, as the same thing as a country accent. So I think that performance of country music involves performance of a Southern accent, and in particular, you could even call it a hyper-rhoticity, because modern American Southern accents are rhotic and have I mean, traditionally they were non-rhotic, but they have undergone this process of restoration of R, and it shows up in words therefore like start and heart, like I said before, and it can even end up with what you would call a sesquisyllabic pronunciation, where a word like for would instead sound more like fower. It sounds like almost two beats of a song. A syllable and a half is what sesquisyllabic means. So country performers have ended up including rhoticity, perhaps even overemphasizing it in their performance, to such an extent that I think now if you hear an American singer be heavily rhotic, it sounds like they either are hamming it up or being campy, or they're definitely attempting to sound like country music. So we'll need to get back to that appropriation discussion, I think, at some point here, because of the fact that a lot of other American music that is neither R&B nor hip hop, but also neither country, ends up being non-rhotic as well, for probably reasons of appropriation. And I have seen this written, I have heard this spoken. I can't remember names to attribute it to, but there's an argument out there that country music has become markedly over-rhoticized, in a sense to distinguish it from all other varieties of American English, which are non-rhotic in part through this mechanism of appropriating African American speech. So it's as if it actually makes it hyper-white. Mm-hmm. Overemphasizes the whiteness of the music to make it extra rhotic. And that's kind of a critical cultural analysis, but it makes sense. The music and the part of the country is so tied together with particular types of conservative values and so forth that it wouldn't be a surprise that if there was any variety in which this over-rhoticization would happen, it would be country music.
Right, and I would expect it to be, you would be able to tell how conservative the singer is just based on that. Because there are country singers who are not conservative.
Right.
And so I would expect, based on this, that they would not be hyper-rhoticizing.
That would be really interesting to look at. Yeah, that's yeah. The genre is marked by, the content of the lyrics pertaining to the things that country music singers sing about. I want to say tractors and barbecues and stuff like that, but
horses.
More than that, sentimentality and everything else, and tradition and so forth. And I know that's probably a gross overgeneralization of the content. The musical content involves, particular musical styles and a slide steel guitar and sometimes violin accompaniment and strummed acoustic guitars and accompanied also by electric guitars. But that probably is enough to make a song sound country. But then if you overlay it with the linguistic performance, then it's like it's extra country as well. There's examples also of country music appropriators that we could talk about.
Sure.
They kind of demonstrate the same sort of process. And so something like, Garth Brooks.
I got friends in low places where the whiskey drowns and the beer chases my blues away. I'll be okay.
Or Taylor Swift, people who are not from the South.
Kiss her and I should have. And when I got home, for I said amen, asking God if he could play it again.
Shania Twain is another example of this.
Let's go, girls.
Keith Urban actually is a huge example of this.
He's Australian, right?
He's not even from the same continent. Yes.
It's so black and white, he's stealing your thunder. Baby blue ain't your color.
And so what they all do is employ this extra rhotic facet of performance when they perform. Most of them are rhotic anyway, so Shania Twain is, Garth Brooks is, he's from, I think, Oregon. Taylor Swift is from the Northeast. And she does this more so when she's in her country mode as opposed to when she's in her pop music mode. But when they do country performance, it's almost as if they lengthen to some extent some of those syllable final R consonants. As a part, I guess, of perhaps making the whole performance sound more authentic in the same way that let's say Iggy Azalea, what if she were to perform hip hop just in a really natural Australian accent? Or if Macklemore was to do this type of performance using his own accent, like how would that come across? And it might be interesting, but it might make it sound like less, I guess, credible hip hop. In the same way that someone like Garth Brooks, if he's trying to perform credible country music, he's in this position where if he doesn't also adopt the linguistic performance, same thing with Shania Twain. If she doesn't adopt the linguistic performance, then she doesn't come across as like a member of the musical community, I guess you could say. So the parallels are there. It's just, I think there's no obvious power differential in the country music appropriation, whereas there's an obvious power differential in the hip hop appropriation scenario.
I'm kind of reminded, I mean, they're not considered country, but Mumford and Sons.
Yes.
I will wait for you.
So they would be performing to try to sound like the genre, right? Because they're not American.
Yes.
Which I did not know.
Yes.
So, yeah, right, okay.
So they're one of the few, I think, they're British, correct? I think they might even be Welsh.
Oh, maybe. I think they're British, but I'm not sure about the Welsh.
And they're, I believe that as speakers, they're non-rhotic. That's my memory. But they're one of the few contemporary British performers that actually does use rhoticity when they sing. So they're actually one of the small examples of people who you can say like, oh, well, they are trying to sound American. It's not that they go accentless. It might be that some of their listenership believes that they go accentless, to call back to how we started off the discussion, but they appear to employ rhoticity in a part, I think, to gravitate towards the genre which they're trying to perform, which is not quite country music. It's country oriented. There's actually this cluster of folk and mountain derived music, of which country music is one, but it's perhaps more kind of bluegrass driven, which is associated with the same part of the country or a similar part of the country. And probably an authentic bluegrass performer would sound more credible if that performer sounded rhotically American instead of non-rhotically British.
Right. And so that's what they're performing.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, I looked it up. They're from London, or at least that's what they say they originated. So.
Okay, there you go. To go back to Trudgill's analysis that was really making use of whether the performer is rhotic or not as a way of gauging whether a singer was trying to sound American or not. The number of other performers that I've been able to notice myself who've done this is really small. So I'm talking about performers who become rhotic as otherwise non-rhotic British English speakers. The Beatles are kind of the data point in Trudgill's work that provide an example of this. Another example of this would have been Robert Plant when he was in Led Zeppelin. Not all of his work was like this, but a fair amount of what he performed was rhotic. So you can go back and hear words with syllable final R's pronounced in them in contexts where you expect them not to be pronounced.
Someone told me there's a girl out there with love in her eyes and flowers in her hair.
Not, like I said, not in all of his work, but in a lot of it. But other than that, there's actually a really, really small number of people who do this. The other ones would be occasionally Sting. Then Ian Curtis of Joy Division actually quite invariably did this, and it's not clear why, because he wasn't really performing anything like a variety that you would say this is American music and we're trying to sound American when we do this. And he was a non-rhotic speaker, but lots of R's in syllable final position when he would perform. And that's almost it. Other than that, I would point out to maybe Adele on the one hand, and Ed Sheeran on the other hand. So Adele has a quite strongly remarkable London accent when she speaks. When she sings, she puts on something that's quite different from that too. So she goes for rhoticity. She actually also undoes this trap bath split where she'll make her bath vowel sound like the same as her trap vowel. She'll say pass and dance and everything else like that in song. And she also attempts to go rhotic when she performs. But there's a number of different things that kind of suggest that she's aiming for something but not hitting any particular target. So she's kind of going for another sort of pan-American kind of target there.
Hello, it's me. I was wondering if after all these years you'd like to meet to go over everything.
I was listening to some Ed Sheeran before this, and I would not be surprised if a British listener listened to him and thought, oh, he doesn't sound English at all when he sings. But there's a bunch of English things that he actually keeps when he does perform, including non-rhoticity. So he's quite non-rhotic, and there's words like stop or body that he'll actually say more like stop or body instead. And it's almost as like you start to listen to the details and you realize, no, he's just actually using an R&B genre of music, but projecting an English voice over it. It's actually kind of interesting to hear once you pay close attention to it.
I may be crazy, don't mind me. Say, boy, let's not talk too much. Grab on my waist and put that body on me. Come on now, follow my lead. Come on now, follow my lead.
I think I have a question that I realized that I was wondering about the whole time. How conscious is this all?
You know, I don't know how conscious it is whatsoever. I think it varies from singer to singer.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah. Like Iggy Azalea, right, would be very conscious, probably.
Conscious, tone deaf, but conscious. Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
I don't know if so if we had the opportunity to sit down here with Adele and ask her about it, I don't know how much detail she could actually give to us. She might say something like, well, yeah, I'm not singing in my own voice. She might actually claim that she's not trying.
That would be interesting.
That it's just something that's kind of unconscious. And I don't mean to pick on her in particular. That imagine a lot of musicians are like this. They don't even know, they don't know that they're doing it necessarily, or they might be highly conscious of it and do it on purpose.
Yeah, I have to assume some people are doing one and some people are doing the other, because it's just, that's humans. We're complicated.
Yeah, and I think it's also probably linked to the genre that the person is performing. So if they're trying to perform a genre that is very clearly culturally associated with some other group, like R&B or like country music, then I think that the intention of the performer is a lot more obvious there, as opposed to, let's say, I don't know, something as widely variable as Meghan Trainor on the one hand.
Because you know I'm all about that bass, no trouble. I'm all about that bass, no trouble.
Or John Mayer.
But if you give me just one night, you're gonna see me in a new light. Yeah, if you give me just...
Or Weezer.
Don't you ever fear, I'm always there. I know that you'll be there. Your tongue is twisted.
All of whom are white American performers who employ non-rhoticity in their performance. Performing music that is not as obviously African American in its origins, you could say. But I think what it brings us back to is the acknowledgement that it needs to be made, which is that for the most part, with the exception of country music and other mountain-derived genres, the entirety of modern American music is African American in its origins.
Right.
And so American rock singers, even in the 60s, even if they were rhotic when they would speak, would probably have veered towards performing non-rhoticity because of the African American origins of the music that they were adopting at the time. And I think that's kind of stuck around as an index of rock music more generally. Much modern American popular music and rock music retains this non-rhoticity on account of its roots. It persists into genres that seem so far removed from the African American roots of what became popular American music. So modern metal and modern punk music, things that you don't think of as black genres, performers in those genres are nevertheless sometimes non-rhotic because of the fact that it seems for modern performers to mark or index music or rock music as opposed to music of African American origin. But it's still not necessarily uniformly so. So you can still find examples of recent or contemporary American rock music where the performer actually does maintain rhoticity. And so it's sort of like a different subset of performers who actually do perform in their own voice and they're not appropriating in the same sense. And it's true of some modern pop music, like Katy Perry actually is rhotic when she sings.
I got the eye of the tiger, the fighter, dancing through the fire, 'cause I am the champion, and you're gonna hear me roar.
Sarah Bareilles is another example of a modern singer-songwriter who's rhotic when she sings. And the music that she plays is essentially as African American in origin as any other modern American genre, but she doesn't appropriate the voice in the same way.
You can be amazing, you can turn a phrase into a weapon or a drug. You can be the outcast, to be the backlash of somebody's lack of love.
Even Kurt Cobain could be an example of this. Like a lot of his contemporaries were non-rhotic during that grunge movement. So Pearl Jam, and Soundgarden, all those bands had singers who would drop their R's when they sang. But I think Kurt Cobain actually stood out as someone who didn't do that. It's not what he's known for, but from my point of view, as the linguist who pays attention to that type of detail, he maintained rhoticity when he sang. Kind of interesting point.
Now I want to listen to all of this music.
Yes.
And find the R's.
We should have a record party.
Yes, we totally should. I would love that.
Yeah.
And the best thing about this is I'm going to have so many songs to post.
Yes.
One of my favorite things.
And sound clips to add.
Oh yeah, tons.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, it's always a good excuse to put some George Michael in there too, if you feel you need to get an excuse to do that.
Oh yeah, that's a good point.
Just a random example I just pulled out, but I was wondering, what did he do when he performed during the peak of his career? And a song like Faith, I actually listened to it a couple of minutes ago. To my ear, it sounds like he's just British in the song. He's non-rhotic, and he's got some monophthongs. He actually had quite a thick northern accent. He's not from Manchester, but he was from,
That's interesting.
I think, York. So his accent was quite different from most English accents that I would imagine most of your viewers would know about. He would have sounded a lot like Mel B, who's got a Yorkshire accent as well, and that comes through in his song actually.
Or if anyone's watched All Creatures Great and Small, maybe they would be aware of the Yorkshire accent.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, Game of Thrones fans probably are aware of it now too.
Oh yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
Oh, and I forgot one thing to mention at the beginning. You're also the creator of LOL phonology.
Yes, that's
or LOL phonology. How do you say it? Do you say LOL?
I say LOL phonology.
Oh, okay.
Because we're both old.
Yes. Yes, I guess that's one of my other alter egos is LOL phonology. So for your viewers, it's a Facebook page that I use to share captioned memes, basically, that are meant to be humor that linguists would find funny. It's a niche market, but it's been a lot of fun doing it. I've been doing that for like 10 years actually. 10 years this summer. I started out with just cats, and now about 4 years after that, I realized, wait, when people do captioning, they don't just do cats. And I was so relieved because I was out of ideas. It was always the same joke using these cat pictures. And so then I got into like studying the more currently used meme templates that people would adopt and use. So I got a big kick out of doing that. And I took a break for about a year recently. I had some writer's block, and I ended up having negative associations with memeing in general because there was so much really nasty negative memeing that came about during and after the most recent presidential election, that the whole concept for me was just marked as nasty, and I just could not get back into doing it. But, for the past couple of months, I've been publishing some new work. And in the meantime, I've seen there's some meme pages out there that actually have far, far more followers than mine. But most of the work that I put up there is original. As in, like, if somebody sends me something, I'll post it and credit them. But I've mostly done original work there.
Well, happy anniversary.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. Yeah.
I totally understand why you had to take a break. I would have had to too. I also had that same sort of icky feeling around memes for a while. But I'm glad you're back, because we can't let the assholes win.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, we have to reapproach memeing for its original purpose, which is just to share humor,
right?
Nested in this cultural knowledge, and not use it as ways of undercutting someone else's life or ideology or anything else like that. And I actually had a rule that I instituted for myself in the first place when I first started doing it was, I make these memes that are things that are supposed to find humor in linguistic topics, but I never ever wanted to make fun of a particular scholar or make fun of a particular theory. So I deliberately never got into the idea of making an individual or even a particular theoretical stance as the butt of a joke, unless it was some kind of inside joke where, practitioners of a theory would also find it humorous.
Right.
Something like that. Yeah.
Yeah, that's something that's really important to me too. I don't ever want to shit on subfields of linguistics. I think it's really nasty. And yeah, so I also do not want to participate in that.
Yeah. Yeah. So, as the, I guess, caretaker and contributor to this particular online site, I actually have kind of an interesting role to try to curate over that type of thing as well. So, it's a rule that I hold myself to, and I do occasionally share other people's work, but I'm never going to share something from someone that's nasty in that way.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, it would be awesome to have you talk about memes and how to put them together, but I think that's outside of our purview. So maybe if we can find some other podcast that you can talk about this on, because I would just love it. I would find it so fascinating.
Yeah, no, that would be really cool if we could find a way to make that happen. Well, we were also talking about doing a language and sports thing.
Yes.
Which we could do at a later date as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. We will definitely tap you for a second time. So listeners, be prepared.
Fantastic.
Okay, well, thank you so much for coming on our show.
Hey, it's my pleasure. Thank you for taking the time to talk about it. It's always a lot of fun to talk about this, and I think that we probably talked or could have talked for a few more hours, especially if we were all in the same room with YouTube in front of us. That I think that it would have been kind of a 3-day party or something. Definitely.
Oh yeah, definitely.
But yes, I could talk about this forever. It's really cool.
I know. Especially since I want to be like, well, what about so-and-so? And what about so-and-so?
And also, in a place where we don't need air conditioning, because I'm starting to boil here. We had to turn off the air conditioning for this.
Oh, yeah, for our professionalism, so we don't hear the air conditioning. Yeah, and I think it's going to bring a broader interest, too. We might get some people that are like, oh, I didn't know that, linguistics was relevant here.
It always is.
It's always relevant. Yes. Well, thank you so much. And we always end our show with, is it our slogan, our motto, our life's work?
Our tagline?
Our tagline. It's my life's work, too.
Yes, don't be an asshole.
Don't be an asshole.
Wiser words have never been spoken.
Okay, bye.
Bye, thank you.
R is a consonant, a letter in the alphabet. R is a consonant, a letter in the alphabet. Er, 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 er.
The Vocal Fries podcast is produced by Chris Ayres for Halftone Audio. Theme music by Nick Granum. You can find us on Tumblr, Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at Vocal Fries Pod. You can email us at vocalfriespod@gmail.com.